Two of the most dangerous gangs in Honduras agree to stop their violence but refuse to turn in their weapons. What impact will there be on one of the most dangerous countries in the world? Plus,
the Jersey Shore is back and it is open for business.
Reassuring words from President Obama 7 months after Hurricane Sandy struck the northeastern U.S. But how are low-income areas in the region faring? You're watching Inside Story Americas from Washington. Hello, I'm Shihab Rattansi. The MS-13 and 18th Street gangs have announced from a Honduras prison that they'll stop their killing and extortion. In return, they want the Honduran government to provide job training programs and help their rehabilitation in society. The gangs have also called on security forces to stop their violence. But the Roman Catholic bishop who mediated the talks says peace may take some time.
Muy violento en el país.
The atmosphere in the country is extremely violent and revenge killings are going to continue. I calculate that it will take 2 generations for any of this to change in Honduras.
Honduras has the highest murder rate in the world, and though it is struggling to cope with drug trafficking and gang violence, there are also land disputes and the political turmoil that has followed the 2009 coup that deposed President Manuel Zelaya. There is hope, though, that Honduras will follow the example of neighboring El Salvador, where gang leaders agreed to a truce last year that did sharply reduce the number of violent deaths. Al Jazeera's Rachel Levin reports from San Pedro Sula in Honduras.
Leaders from the 2 most powerful gangs here in Honduras have agreed to stop all violence, which means they have agreed to stop all murders, extortions, and any other type of criminal activity. They made the announcement here on Tuesday from the prison that you see behind me. And what they're asking in exchange is for the government to provide them with economic opportunities and training programs. They specifically want those programs not just here in the prisons, but throughout the country. And they are calling on the president of this country to respond and to enter into a dialogue. Now, it still remains to be seen if the president will engage, and also remains to be seen how Honduran society will respond to this move. Everybody here agrees that it's a positive step forward, but people are cautiously optimistic because back in 2005, these 2 gangs also had another peace treaty, if you will, with each other. Now, that peace was very tentative. It only lasted less than 2 months. So while many people here applaud these efforts, they're still very cautious, and now they're waiting to see if the government will respond and what they will say.
Joining me now in the studio is Adrienne Pine. She's a professor of anthropology at American University. She's worked extensively in Honduras. And from Los Angeles, Thomas Ward, a professor of anthropology at the University of Southern California. And he specializes in youth violence and gangs. Professor Ward, Southern California seems to be a good place to begin, in fact. I mean, the origins of MS-13 and Barrio 18 then, I mean, their roots are there in Southern California.
Yes, that's correct. 18th Street Gang, also known as Calle 18 or Mata 18, started in Los Angeles in the early 1960s. MS, or Mata Salvatrucha, started in Los Angeles as a stoner gang, as MSS, in the late 1970s, and both of those gangs have expanded considerably. And
Professor Pine, I mean, this is a fascinating example of blowback in some ways amidst the US-sponsored carnage in Latin America in the 80s, I guess. I mean, this is why there were these communities in Los Angeles who I guess were trying to fit in.
So. Oh, absolutely. I mean, you had communities, large communities of Salvadorans who had fled US-sponsored massacres in that country and, you know, of course, were without a stable base and looking for a way to protect themselves in large part.
Professor Ward, then, we have this moment then in the 90s when policies tightened as far as those who were being arrested and gang members were being deported back to Central America. So that's how then the gang problem spiraled in places like Honduras and El Salvador and Guatemala.
Yes, everyone agrees that the major contributing factor to the spread of street gangs in Central America was the mass deportations of these gang members from various parts of the United States. what used to be called INS, Immigration Naturalization Service, had a gang task force, and they began in the mid-1990s deporting thousands of these gang members back to their countries of origin, Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador. When these people arrived back into their home countries, many of them had only very vague memories and maybe no family connections. And so in order to adapt and survive in their home environments, they turned to what they knew, which was street gangs.
And Professor Pine, the government response was a crackdown.
Oh, absolutely. And it's important to note that there's a different history in El Salvador and Honduras. And so many of the Hondurans who had been also in LA, got involved in these gangs that were largely Salvadoran in origins, but went back to Honduras and formed them. But the countries have different histories. So El Salvador had this very revolutionary history. And, a lot of these gang members are the children of revolutionaries and guerrilla fighters, whereas Honduras didn't have that same history, but in both places there was a crackdown that was largely led by zero tolerance policy ideology and brought down, in fact, by Rudy Giuliani, the former mayor of New York, as a consultant for very right-wing governments. And this resulted in both places in the extrajudicial murders of vast numbers of young people over the decade of the 2000s, late 1990s and 2000s in Honduras. I think around 10,000 young men who were, it's important to note, excluded from the labor market as a result of U.S. neoliberal policies of privatization and resource extraction going back decades in Honduras, and then excluded for the same reasons, but also because of the war devastation in El Salvador. And so young men had little to do but turn to gangs for protection from a state that was increasingly violent against them, including carrying out death squad killings. And some of those death squad leaders include in Honduras the current National Commissioner of Police, Juan Carlos Bonilla, and the current president's former Minister of Security, Oscar Alvarez.
And we've done programs, I think, with you actually on Inside Story Americas about Bonilla and the controversies that surround him. But Professor Ward, I mean, that just sounds like it was this sort of self-sustaining, almost low-level civil war underway. I know you've talked a great deal to those who joined these gangs in Honduras. What motivations did they tell you that they had for being members of the gang, and why do you think they might be putting them aside now?
Well, it's important to understand that all street gangs, whether in Central America, in the United States, and we now have street gangs in Europe, they're adaptations to hostile environments. And so you have children in poor communities, often from dysfunctional families, families who have various hardships. And often the school system is breaking down, and they are often violent environments. And so as an adaptation to this, youth are attracted to the gang as a surrogate family, as a group to belong to, as a way of having someone who cares about you, someone who will protect you, and there's also the economic component of shelter and safety. And so there are many different reasons why youth join these street gangs, but all of them come from these hostile environments, and there are multiple reasons boiled down to this adaptation to that.
So why are things changing now, Professor Wood?
Well, I see the Honduran gang truce or peace treaty between the two largest gangs falling on the coattails of what happened in El Salvador as a way of negotiating with the government to try to ameliorate the situation. I applaud any efforts at reducing gang violence or any violence, and I should say that gang violence in Honduras represents maybe 30 to 40% of all of the violence. And so this is a small part, but a significant part of reducing the amount of violence. And as was mentioned before, Honduras has the highest homicide rate in the world. So obviously a lot needs to be done. However, gang truce by itself is not going to be sufficient in ameliorating the situation. There has to be, as the gang members have asked for, education, job opportunities, training. There has to be negotiations about improving the communities and the social conditions from which these gangs are spawned, because if the communities are not changed, then the conditions that create the gangs, that encourage these kids to get into the gangs, are going to make it so that the truce will not be able to hold.
So, Professor Pine, this is the key question. Clearly there's been this decision both in the barrios and the neighborhoods and in the jails for a change in the way that the gangs are thinking about their lives. But what about the government? Is there any indication, given some of the history of the death squads, of those who are in very senior positions in the government and the security forces, and generally their opinion of a welfare state, perhaps, and social justice? I mean, what chance then is there for this sort of Marshall Plan for the barrios that might
right.
occur?
Well, you know, the conditions of violence that create gangs, I think the most important determinant of that in Honduras is the fact that it's an militarily occupied country by the United States, and the current government is the result of a military coup that was supported by the U.S. government in 2009, and its primary purpose has been to destroy all of the social protections as well as democratic checks. And so the country has become a democracy-free neoliberal zone in which land, water, and subsoil rights are being auctioned off to the highest bidder, and anybody who protests that is labeled a criminal, a gang member, or a terrorist even. And so
when Professor Ward talks about gang violence only being 30% of the violence or 40% of the violence, does this account for much of the rest
well,
of the
gangs are being, I think they're speaking quite correctly in saying not just that they need job training and entree into civil society and all of that, but most importantly, they need the death squads to end. They need state security forces to stop attacking the citizenry. And I'm not just talking about gangs here, but anybody who stands up against the violence of the state. And so they're acting as, you know, important political actors in this case, not just for themselves, but for the country.
Professor Thomas Ward, thank you very much. Professor Adrienne Pine, thank you as well.
Thank you.
Now, as President Obama toured the shoreline that 7 months ago saw major damage after Hurricane Sandy, he highlighted the progress that's been made. But he was careful to point out that there remained a long road to recovery.
Now, we all understand there is still a lot of work to be done. There are homes to rebuild. There are businesses to reopen. There are landmarks and beaches and boardwalks that aren't all the way back yet.
And tens of thousands are still displaced. Others say that they're still dealing with mold infestations. And while undocumented workers have played a vital role in helping the region rebuild, many of them have not received the help they need after their homes were destroyed. And we're joined from New York by Aria. She's the executive director of the Action Center, a community-based organization in Brooklyn, New York, which has been focusing on recovery efforts after Hurricane Sandy. And also from New York, we have Joe Kupferman. He's the executive director of the New York Environmental Law and Justice Project. Aria, when we last spoke, you helped us understand actually the particular focus of your group, and it was a subsection of the Rockaways where much of the public housing was located. And when we spoke last year, the main problem was this thick black mold. Has that now been removed?
No, it hasn't, and it remains a problem. We do periodic tests from residents. We have them do surveys to let us know what are the issues that they're continuing to face. And 73% of those that we surveyed still have thick black mold in their apartments, in their houses. Either it's being painted over or not at all. And then now with the warm weather coming, we're worried about what has been eradicated growing back.
So, I mean, are there still the health problems associated with these sorts of mold, the respiratory problems and such?
Yeah, they continue to take place, and we're trying to gather statistical data, and also different organizations are doing the same thing to try and spot exactly what's happening as a result of the mold being there. But we want to make sure that this problem is taken care of as quickly as possible, sooner rather than later, before the health concerns are too far for us really to be able to do anything about them.
Just to help us understand that number, you said 73%. I mean, how many people are we talking about here?
Well, you're talking about, we surveyed 500 for that particular survey, so 73% of the 500 we surveyed are still having mold issues. And we call the people that we surveyed in this particular one the second wave, because in addition to the mold issues, they're finding themselves falling through the crack because of Sandy for other reasons as well, including having lost a job, or having a company having to lay them off because of Sandy, or having all of their support system, their mother, father, brother, cousin, grandparents who've been affected by Sandy and are no longer able to support their child care needs or helping them make it to the end of the month. These people are still in line, and these people are still suffering, and it's long-term suffrage.
As far as painting over the mold as opposed to cleaning it was concerned, actually, Aria, at the time, you mentioned that because unionized workers weren't allowed to work on some of these blocks because it was so hazardous and they didn't have the safety equipment, a lot of people were being brought in to work in these areas who simply weren't trained. And so, in fact, maybe painting was the best that they thought they could do. I mean, is that basically what happened?
Yeah, it is what happens, and it's what we understand continues to happen for those apartments and those low-income housing that's actually getting any attention at all. Workers are not properly trained, they're not covered, and they themselves are not protected. The union, rightly so, to protect their workers, said, no, we're not going to allow this to happen. But then our question and concern becomes then, who's hiring these people? Are they in a position to say what is going on is not good? Do they even have health coverage to handle some of the issues that are going to come after they do an improper cleanup?
And Joe, I mean, this is an issue that you raised when we spoke last year about third-party workers and who these workers are. And in many cases, they are undocumented workers who clearly have difficulty complaining about safety conditions because they fear deportation.
Exactly true. All the workers were shortchanged. OSHA issued 3,200 reports.
The Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I should say. Yeah.
Exactly.
OSHA,
I'm sorry. Yes, 3,200 reports, and only 32 people were fined. So the workers who were unionized and documented workers got some protection, but very, very little. So the short end of the stick again were the undocumented workers. And we also heard many, many stories that they had rashes from touching the water, and they had nowhere to go, nowhere to report, and also was really important that there was no cleanup stations. Usually when you work in these type of conditions, you're allowed to clean up afterwards, and those were not provided.
And of course, because they're undocumented, they can't apply for healthcare, presumably, then. And of course, they weren't getting federal aid for their own families to help restore their own homes in these areas affected, I suppose, Joel.
No health care and no ability to complain, and they basically kept on, having to work. And also, we got to remember that the conditions were horrible in terms of even transportation back and forth. Many of them had to work overtime, which put them into even a greater zone of danger.
Beyond the mold, there's another issue that Joel, you've been documenting, I think, this idea of tainted water. What exactly is going on?
It's tainted water. After Sandy, a lot of the storage plants in New York City stopped working because of lack of electricity. So we had millions and millions of gallons of sewage coming on to the land, combined with chemicals from gas burners, oil tanks, all becoming one bad, dangerous admixture. And these workers were exposed to these chemicals. The sad part is, one thing we didn't learn from 9/11 is that it wasn't tested. We kept on demanding that the federal, the state, and the city government test the water, and we kept on getting back the answer that there's no way these pipes could be broken, city water supply is fine, and whatever sewage was there would be just washed away.
But people are apparently showing symptoms, though.
Yes, it's not just, it's workers and residents. The Good Medical Clinic at Aria's center, the Action Center, did document people getting rashes. We tested the water, and we came up with something called heterotrophic bacteria, and we had a fight to just get people to admit that this could be a problem. In this heterotrophic bacteria, some of those forms are parasitic. And yet we got the answer from the city and the state that there's no problem, go away, leave us alone.
There's another issue, Aria. There was a fear that in the aftermath of Hurricane Sandy, there would be pressure on poorer families to clear out of the area, quite frankly, either through a lack of money for them to restore their homes and their belongings, or simply by being evacuated and not being allowed to return. In fact, I remember you telling me that actually one of the reasons why people were having these symptoms and staying in these mold-infested buildings is because they were really worried that they wouldn't be able to come back eventually. Did that finally happen there? I mean, is there any evidence that that did happen?
Well, right now, everything is at a standstill because residents are not leaving. They're still not leaving because they are concerned with not being able to return. But one of the things that's happening that freezes them out, so to speak, is the focused help that needs to come to clean up the apartments that they're afraid to leave is not coming. Outside organizations or pop-up groups who, when I say pop-up, they formed immediately after Sandy, they're being funded to do most of the mold remediation work and that type of stuff. But community organizations and groups that actually work with the people who need it the most are being passed over, because we would make sure that there's focused help taking place in these apartments where people are afraid to leave. But without us really being there on the front lines and being able to make sure that this remediation is taking place, they're in the same situation they were in when we talked 4 months ago.
So the focus there is on homeowners as opposed to renters or those in public housing.
Mm-hmm. Homeowners and higher rather than low-income homeowners. We have low-income homeowners who are facing some of the same issues. Part of the reason they're facing it is if organizations don't know who they are or understand their needs, then they do get passed over. It's simpler to take care of the folks that you can communicate best with. But also because who the squeaky wheel gets the attention, the hardest, which is one reason why we're here talking for the people who need to have it articulated for themselves.
But is the money reaching the poorest, those who already were very poor before even Sandy? I mean, is that money getting through as people donate?
Absolutely not. And when I say absolutely not, that's twofold. There are people that came to the rescue of Far Rockaway. There are people that came to the rescue and helped the Action Center, and it wasn't even their mandate to do so. People that included Tyson and Kimberly Chandler from the Knicks, are included the list is so long, mothers who had bake sales, or the Yarrows and other people that are known and unknown that came and helped us to be able to take care. But then when you have concerts that are put on where millions of dollars are raised, or even where people are texting and tweeting $10 to other organizations to help, that money has not found its way into the zip codes of Auburn and Edgemere and Far Rockaway. Those zip codes have not had the money come there, and yet that's where it's most desperately needed. And we're still waiting, and unfortunately our residents who are suffering are still waiting as well. I would say, if I can, I would say people who text and tweeted those $10 or attended those concerts, even put on those concerts, should really call the people who are in charge of that and say, why isn't money getting to these neighborhoods? Why aren't the people who understand them the best and can get the work to them the closest being listened to and respected, and making sure that that help gets to them? I would say I would put it back into the hands of the people who donated and say it's not just enough to, to click and then to move on, but find out and hold people accountable to make sure the people who need it the most are the people who are getting it.
Joe, what about the suspicion that the sort of things that we saw happen after Katrina in New Orleans were going to happen in the Rockaways and elsewhere? Are we seeing signs that developers are beginning to move in?
Definitely. We have been representing a few tenant associations, actually several, in Manhattan, where in order to make up for the so-called budget gaps, they're selling, leasing off land right in the middle of those housing developments. They want to build 20, 30-story luxury towers at the expense of those existing residents. There's two major problems. One, it's on a floodplain. How do we build right next to the river? And two, these people are going to be losing their light and air. So we see a land grab already happening in Manhattan, and we're concerned about land grabs happening in the Rockaways, Coney Island, and elsewhere. And I'm really concerned about the residents, the public housing residents, in many ways are getting the shortest end of the stick. NYCHA, the New York City Housing Authority, had declared that mold only went up to the first floor, not above, which is totally false, that we know that mold creeps up all the way up from floor to floor. And the second problem is that there was raw sewage that people were facing in their apartments, and yet NYCHA says there's no problem. New York City has very good health guidelines regarding mold, but no enforcement. They basically have said there's no problem. So people who are small homeowners and tenants have a lot of problems in even trying to get the word out that mold is a problem.
Joel Kupferman, thank you very much. Aria, thank you as well. And that's all from the team in Washington, D.C. for now.